The vibration came through the soles of my boots before it ever reached my ears, a deep, grinding pulse rising out of the rock face itself, and by the time I understood what it meant, 2 of my men were already in the fall line. My name is Aldrich Pressler. I held a surveyor's license from the state of Colorado, issued in 1901, and in September of 1908, I was contracted by the Ouray County Mining Authority to assess a high-altitude ore corridor in the San Juan Mountains above the Uncompahgre Plateau. I am giving this account under oath to this inquiry board 6 weeks and 3 days after the events described. I will say at the outset that I understand how this testimony will sound to men who have spent their careers behind desks in Ouray or Denver. I am asking you to record it anyway. I am asking you to record it because 2 men are dead and their families deserve a document that does not call them an avalanche. I will tell you what I saw. I will tell you what I felt. And I will tell you what I did and what I did not do, and you may judge me for it after. The assignment was routine, or should have been. The authority had identified a potential ore corridor running northeast along a high ridge system above 11,000 feet between 2 established claim boundaries. The work was a standard transect survey, a series of measurements taken along the corridor to assess the grade of the terrain and the viability of a tramway installation. We were not miners. We were not prospectors. We were 4 men with instruments and a mule team, tasked with completing a set of readings before the first hard snow closed the high country for winter. The season in the San Juans can turn in a single afternoon, and everyone who works above 10,000 feet in Colorado understands that September is a conditional month. You work fast, you read your weather, and you come down when the mountain tells you to come down. I had worked that country for 7 years. I knew the sound of snow loading a cornice, the smell of meltwater backing up under talus, the particular quality of silence that precedes a slide. Or I believed I knew those things. I will come to what changed that belief on the 4th day, but first I need to account for the men who were with me, because this inquiry cannot understand what happened without understanding who was there, and how each of them responded when the situation required a decision. Clem Surtees had been my assistant on 4 previous surveys. He was 31 years old, trained as a draftsman, accurate and steady, the kind of man who could read a vernier scale in wind that would water your eyes and give you the reading without error. He had no imagination for danger. I mean that as a description, not a criticism. He had a systematic mind, and systematic minds tend to discount what cannot be measured. That quality served him well in ordinary surveys and put him directly in my path of reasoning on the 4th day when we should have turned the party around. I will say more about that moment when I reach it. I am trying to be orderly. The junior chainmen were brothers, Thomas and Fenn Caldwell from Montrose, 19 and 22 years old respectively. Fenn was the elder. He had worked 3 seasons of survey labor and understood the instruments and the protocols. Thomas was in his first full season and still had the habit of asking questions the answer to which was apparent from context, which irritated Fenn and which I had come to find, over the weeks prior to this assignment, quietly reassuring. A man who asks questions about what he does not understand is less likely to make a fatal assumption. I thought that then. I still believe it. It did not help Thomas in the end. We left Ouray on the morning of September 3rd with the mule team loaded and reached the base of the access trail by early afternoon. The trail climbed approximately 4,000 vertical feet over 9 miles, switching back through spruce timber and then through open alpine, emerging onto the high ridge system at an elevation of just under 12,000 feet. The corridor we were assigned ran for roughly 2 miles along the northeast face of the ridge, a steep and exposed piece of ground with the ridge crest above us and a long talus field below, the talus pitching down several hundred feet to a narrow valley floor. The geology was predominantly quartzite and compressed limestone, the face itself solid in most places, but fractured along the upper ridge where frost cycles had worked the rock for centuries. We established camp on the 2nd day, at a position approximately 1/3 of the way along the assigned corridor. A relatively flat bench of perhaps 40 feet wide, cut back into the slope. sheltered on the uphill side by a low rock wall of natural formation. The site was exposed to wind from the northwest, but protected from above by the ridge mass, and the bench gave us a stable platform for the instruments. It was, by the standards of high-altitude survey work, a good camp. I selected it myself. I have thought about that selection every night since. The mules were picketed on a secondary bench below ours, reached by a short scramble down the talus. There were 4 of them, good mountain animals, experienced in rough terrain. I mention the mules because what happened with them on the second night was the first sign, the one I noted in my field book and then set aside, and I want this inquiry to understand that the sign was there, and that I registered it, and that I made a choice about what it meant. On the night of September 4th, the second night in camp, the mules became restless at approximately 2 in the morning. Not frantic, not the behavior you see when a predator is in close proximity, when the animals pull their lines and roll their eyes and call out. This was different. They shifted constantly, moved in tight circles, pressed against one another. When Fen Caldwell went down to check them just before dawn, he found that 2 of them had abraded their fetlocks against the picket line from the continuous movement. They were calm by first light. They ate. There was no sign of a predator in the area, no tracks, no scat, no disturbed ground beyond what the mules themselves had churned up. I noted it. I did not know what to make of it. Mountain horses and mules are sensitive to subsonic vibration, to the low-frequency precursors of rockfall and slide, and it occurred to me that the animals may have felt something in the ground that our instruments were not calibrated to detect. I checked the weather report in my field book and noted a low-pressure system moving through the range that night, which can produce exactly that kind of subsonic event as snow load shifts on upper cornices. I logged it as a possible atmospheric disturbance and moved on. That was my first mistake, and I want it entered into the record as such. The morning of the 5th was the 3rd full working day. The crew set out along the corridor at first light. Myself and Surtees on the transit, and Rod, while the Caldwell brothers moved ahead, chaining distances. The work was going well. We were maintaining a pace that would complete the transect in 5 to 6 days, leaving time before the weather window closed. The air that morning was clear and cold, about 34 degrees at sunrise, warming slowly toward the mid-40s by midday. The sky was a hard blue with high cloud building to the west, which I noted but did not consider alarming at that stage. It was just after 2 in the afternoon when I first felt it. I was bent over the transit, setting a reading, and it came up through the tripod legs and into my hands before I was aware of it. A vibration. Low, sustained, longer than the brief percussion of a rockfall, different in character from the rolling tremor of a distant explosion in one of the lower mines. It lasted perhaps 8 seconds, and then stopped. I straightened and looked at the ridge above us. Nothing moved. The rock face was still, the snow patches on the upper cornice undisturbed. I looked at Surtees, who was holding the rod 50 yards away, and he had stopped moving and was looking at his feet. "Ground shudder," he said. "Settling, probably." I nodded. I believed him. The San Juans are a seismically restless range, and minor ground tremors are not uncommon at altitude, particularly in areas where freeze-thaw cycles have stressed the underlying rock. I reset the transit and we continued. But I will tell you what I did not say to Surtees in that moment, because this deposition requires the whole truth and not a manageable portion of it. I will tell you that the vibration had passed through the soles of my boots before it reached the tripod. I felt it in my feet first, rising from the rock on which I was standing, and for the 3 or 4 seconds before I consciously identified it as a geological event, my body had already formed a different interpretation. My teeth had come together. The small muscles in my calves had contracted. My body had understood something before my mind did, and my mind overruled it, and I logged the event as a ground tremor and continued with the afternoon's readings. We were back in camp by 5, the light going flat and orange across the ridge, and it was then, while Fen Caldwell was starting the stove, that Thomas said he had seen something on the upper cornice while we were working that afternoon. He had not mentioned it at the time because he thought he was mistaken about what he saw, and because Fen had been on him all week about making observations he could not verify. But in camp, away from Fen's immediate supervision, he came to me and he told me that around the time of the ground vibration, he had looked up toward the ridge crest and seen something on the cornice that was not a rock formation, something that extended beyond the lip of the ridge and then pulled back. I asked him how large. He thought for a moment and said it was hard to judge at that distance, perhaps 500 feet above our position, but that it had the dimensions of a very large animal. Much larger than a bear. He said its underside caught the afternoon light and appeared pale, almost white, like the belly of a fish, but rough-textured, as if the surface was scaled or plated. He had watched it for perhaps 15 seconds before it drew back behind the cornice and was gone. I thanked him and told him to get some rest and said I would consider what he had said. I did not tell Surtees that evening. I should have, and the fact that I did not is the second mistake I am entering into this record. The fourth day was September 6th. We were nearly halfway through the corridor transect, and the work that morning went without incident. The vibration did not occur in the morning session. The mules were calm. The weather remained clear. By the time we stopped for the midday meal, I had almost finished rationalizing Thomas's sighting into something manageable. A large boulder shifting on the cornice, a trick of altitude and distance on an inexperienced man's eye. Then Fen found the camp. He had gone ahead along the corridor to set the far-flagging stake for the afternoon session, about 600 yards beyond our current working position and perhaps 150 feet lower on the slope. He was gone for about 40 minutes. When he came back, he did not have the stakes with him. He came back without them, which was not something Fen Caldwell did. He was a man who finished his tasks before he returned. He came back empty-handed, and he stood at the edge of the bench where we were eating, and he said, "There was a camp down there. Prospectors, by the look of the ground. There's nothing left of it." We went with him. It took about 20 minutes to reach the location, and when we arrived, I understood why Fen had come back without the stakes. The ground had been scoured. There is no other word that carries the right meaning. Not cleared, not swept, not scattered, scoured, as if something had passed over it with tremendous force and friction, dragging everything before it, and leaving behind a surface of bare limestone that had been polished along a swath perhaps 60 feet wide and running straight down the fall line of the slope. The swath began above our position, somewhere on the upper ridge, and terminated at the edge of the talus field, where the ground broke away into the long slope to the valley below. Within the swath, the rock surface itself was scratched and grooved in parallel lines running top to bottom, each groove perhaps an inch wide and a quarter-inch deep, consistent and evenly spaced, running the full length of the scoured path as far as we could follow it. Outside the swath, the slope was undisturbed, loose talus, small vegetation in the rock crevices, a few patches of residual snow. The boundary between the scoured path and the undisturbed slope was clean. Whatever had come down that face had come down in a defined channel. Of the camp, there was almost nothing. A section of bent iron tent peg, driven sideways into a crack in the limestone. A scrap of canvas, perhaps 6 inches square, caught in a rock seam at the edge of the scour path. I found what I believed to be the base plate of a coal oil lantern, crushed flat and stripped of its glass chimney. There were no tools, no supplies, no clothing, no personal effects, and no men. Fen estimated from the tent peg and the scrap of canvas that the camp had been sized for at least 3 people. What I noticed, standing in that scoured path, was the sound, or rather the absence of one. The San Juan high country is never truly silent. There are always birds at that elevation, Clark's nutcrackers, ravens, the small finches that work the snowfields. There was a pair of ravens that had been following our crew all week, perching on the transit case and the pack panniers when we were not watching them. They were not there. The birds were gone from that section of the ridge. No movement, no calling, no wing noise. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own pulse. Surtees examined the scoured path for a long time without speaking. Then he said it was consistent with a debris avalanche. A wet slab slide releasing from the upper cornice and channeling down the fall line could scour a path that width and leave that kind of smooth surface. He said the grooves in the limestone were consistent with rock-on-rock abrasion from a slide carrying embedded debris. He said the camp had simply been in the path and had been swept into the valley below. Thomas said, "Then where is everything? A slide that size would leave debris at the bottom." Surtees said that the debris would have spread across the valley floor and been difficult to see from our position. Fenn said he wanted to go down, not to the valley, not to look for the debris. He meant down the mountain, out of the high country. He said it plainly and without drama, which was characteristic of him. He said that he did not know what had made that path in the rock, but that he did not want to be above it when it happened again. He said he thought we should finish the working day, break camp in the morning, and descend to Ure. I will tell you what I said in response to that, and I will not soften it. I said that the evidence supported an avalanche event. I said that the slide path was on a different line than our camp, and that we were set back into the slope with a natural rock wall above us. I said we had 3 days of work remaining, and a contractual obligation to the mining authority, and that completing the transect was our professional responsibility. I said we would continue. Fenn looked at me for a moment. He was not a man who argued beyond his first statement. He had made his position clear, and I had overruled it, and he accepted that without further protest, because that was the nature of the working relationship. But I want this inquiry to understand that Fenn Caldwell asked to leave the mountain on the afternoon of September 6th, and that I refused that request. I want that in the record verbatim. We went back to work. The vibration came at 3:15 that afternoon, and it lasted 11 seconds. That night I lay in my tent and I thought about the prospectors' camp. I thought about the groove pattern in the limestone. A debris avalanche carries rocks of varying sizes and deposits them chaotically. The scoring from such an event is irregular, multi-directional, and varies with the size of the entrained debris. What I had seen in that rock face was not irregular. The grooves were parallel and evenly spaced. They ran in one direction. They had been made by something with a consistent profile, something that maintained a fixed geometry as it passed over the surface, the way a planing blade makes consistent marks because its cutting edge is uniform. I had heard the stories. Every man who works the high San Juans hears the stories eventually. The timbermen's accounts go back to the 1870s, and by 1908 the creature had accumulated a name and a rough physical description that was consistent across enough independent accounts to constitute something. Not a formal scientific record. Nothing like that. Just a pattern in the testimonies of men who worked the mountains and who agreed, independently, on specific details. A very large animal, pale beneath, rough-surfaced, a hooked tail used to anchor to a summit, a body shaped for the slope, a thing that waited above and came down fast, using the grade of the mountain as its mechanism. That was what the timbermen said. That was what the old prospectors said. That was what Thomas Caldwell had partly seen on the cornice 2 days ago. I lay in my tent in the dark, and I turned that over and over, and what I decided, in the small hours of the morning of September 7th, was that I needed 2 more days. 2 more days, and we would have enough of the transect complete to file a usable report. I told myself that the creature was a legend, a piece of folklore built from misidentified avalanche events by men working alone in stressful conditions. I told myself that I had 7 years of San Juan work experience and sound professional judgment. I told myself these things until I nearly believed them, and then I made my plan for the morning and went to sleep. I should tell the inquiry that I am not a man given to self-deception as a rule. I have reviewed that night many times in the weeks since, trying to understand my own reasoning, and the most honest explanation I can give is this. The survey represented 6 weeks of contracted work. The report fee was substantial, and the alternative was returning to Ouray with an incomplete record and an explanation involving a mountain predator from timber camp legend. Practical men in 1908 do not make that report. They complete the survey, or they find a geological explanation for why they could not. I chose completion over retreat, and 2 men are dead because of it. The morning of September 7th began cold and clear, about 28 degrees at dawn, ice on the tent canvas, and a hard rime frost on the exposed rock of the bench. The mules were restless again when Fenn went down to check them before breakfast, but they had not abraded themselves as badly as the first time. They were moving, circling, but the movement had a different quality this time. Not anxious in the way an animal is anxious around a predator it can smell. More like the movement of an animal that feels the ground wrong under its feet and cannot place the source. Fenn gave them grain and water, and they settled enough to eat, which he reported to me as a sign they were manageable. I will note here that the vibration had not occurred in the previous morning, only in the afternoon. I had formed the hypothesis that whatever was producing it was active only within a certain window of the day, between roughly 2 and 4 in the afternoon, which gave us a safe working period in the morning and early midday. That hypothesis was, as you will understand by the end of this account, catastrophically wrong. But at 7 in the morning of September 7th, it was the working model, and I built the day's plan around it. We set out at 7:30. The plan was to push the transect as far as possible in the morning session, break for midday at 1 o'clock, and be back in camp no later than 1:30 to allow a full hour of buffer before the 2 o'clock window. Surtees and I on the instruments, the Caldwell brothers chaining ahead. The light was good, and the air was still, and the work went efficiently. I remember thinking, somewhere around 10 in the morning, that we were going to get through it. I remember that specific thought. I mention it because it is the kind of thought a man thinks when he is not paying the right kind of attention. At approximately 11:15, Thomas came back from his position on the chain to report that he had found another mark in the rock. He had been setting a flagging pin in a crack in the limestone when he noticed that the surface of the rock below his position, on the downhill side, was scratched in the same pattern we had seen at the prospectors' camp. Not a full scoured swath, just the edge of one, as if the thing that had made it had passed close to the ridge above his position without fully releasing down that face. A partial mark, a trial line, or a correction, or something that had repositioned after its initial pass. The scratches were fresh. The broken surfaces of the limestone in the grooves were bright white, unweathered. I went to look. The mark ran about 30 feet before disappearing into undisturbed slope. It was approximately 40 feet uphill from our survey line, which meant that whatever had made it had passed within 40 feet of where we were working. The grooves were the same profile as those in the scoured path at the prospectors' camp. Same spacing, same depth, same consistent parallel geometry. But this passage had not gone fully down the fall line. It had stopped, or pulled back, or angled off to the side. Surtees looked at the marks and said nothing for a moment. Then he said they were consistent with a previous avalanche event whose debris had been channeled by the ridge topography before losing momentum. He said the exposed limestone in the grooves was probably a result of the freeze-thaw cycle, which regularly spalls fresh faces on high-altitude rock. He was constructing a geological narrative, and he was doing it quickly, and I noticed that his voice was slightly different than his usual survey voice, slightly elevated in pace. He was working to convince himself as much as me. "Clem," I said, "look at the spacing." He looked. He knew what I was pointing at. The grooves were too regular. A slide does not score limestone in parallel lines at consistent intervals. He stood over those marks for perhaps 30 seconds, and I watched him process the information against the framework he had built, and I watched the framework resist. "We should go back to camp," Fenn said from behind us. He had not made another argument for descending the mountain, not since I overruled him the previous afternoon. He had simply worked. But he was looking at the marks now, and he said it again. "We should go back to camp right now." I made the decision in about 5 seconds. We had been working for less than 4 hours. We had made excellent progress. The morning window, which I still believed was safe, had nearly 2 hours remaining. I decided we would work 1 more hour and then turn back to camp early, giving us a margin before the afternoon window. 1 more hour, I said. Then we go in. Thomas looked at Fenn. Fenn said nothing. He picked up the chain and moved back to his position. I am telling you this precisely because the inquiry needs to understand that there were 3 separate moments on that mountain where the decision could have been made differently and was not, and that I was the authority on that survey party, and all 3 decisions were mine. The night of September 4th, when the mules were restless. The afternoon of September 6th, when Fenn asked to descend, and I overruled him. The morning of September 7th, when we found the partial marks, and I chose 1 more hour. 3 decisions. I made all 3. I will carry all 3. We worked for 40 minutes past that point without incident. I was beginning to feel the pressure ease slightly when the vibration came. It came at 5 minutes before noon, not the 2 o'clock window. Noon. I was bent over the transit and it came up through the tripod legs and into my hands, and this time it was different, in a way that I registered immediately. Not as a matter of interpretation, but as a physical fact. It was longer. Not 8 seconds, not 11 seconds. It went on for what I estimate as 30 seconds, and it did not have the character of the previous events, which had been steady and even. This one had a rhythm within it, a pulse that accelerated and then slowed, and then accelerated again, as if something large was moving, repositioning, settling into a new angle. And while it continued, I heard something above the vibration, rising over it as the seconds passed. A sound I had no precedent for at that moment, and that I can now describe only in approximate terms. A long, low exhalation of stone friction, the sound of enormous weight moving across rock, not sliding but deliberate, the grind of something finding its purchase. I looked up. I want to tell you what I saw as accurately as I am capable of, because I understand that this testimony is the record, and that the record will be what it is, forever after this room. I am not a man who sees things that are not there. I hold a state license that required me to pass both a technical examination and a professional character review. I am testifying under oath. What I saw on that ridgeline is what was there. The creature was on the cornice above us. It was positioned lengthwise along the ridge crest, parallel to the fall line, its body pressed against the upper rock face, with its lower surface against the stone. The size is difficult to convey accurately, but I will try. Its body, from what I could see of it, was longer than 2 standard flat car rail lengths, laid end to end, which puts it somewhere above 90 feet. The width across its midsection I estimate at 12 to 15 feet. The coloration of the upper surface was the dark mottled gray-brown of weathered quartzite, which explained why we had not distinguished it from the ridge formation in the days prior. The lower surface, where it pressed against the rock, was the pale color Thomas had described, the white of a limestone belly, rough-textured, ridged in parallel rows that matched exactly the spacing of the groove marks we had found in the scoured path and in the partial mark. I could see that much even at that distance and altitude. The tail was over the cornice, hooked. The term the timberman used was a gaff hook, and looking at it, I could not improve on that description. It curved back over the summit edge and gripped the rock, and I could see from the way the body was tensioned against the slope that the tail was the anchor point, that the tail was holding the whole mass in position against the grade, the same way a gaff holds a boat against a dock. The body was not lying on the slope the way a resting animal lies. It was loaded against it, taut, the way a bowstring is taut when drawn. There was enormous stored force in the posture, and it was directed down the fall line, and the fall line passed through our camp. All of this I took in within approximately 4 seconds. Then I understood. It had been up there all week. The vibrations each afternoon were not geological events. They were repositioning. It had been adjusting its angle on the cornice. Each tremor a small movement, a correction, the way a rifleman adjusts his aim across multiple shots. Each day the vibration had been longer and more frequent because the adjustments had been getting finer. It was not circling our camp or pressing closer in the pattern of a predator learning its ground. It had been aiming. The camp was not where it had stopped last time. The camp was where it had been calibrating toward since the day we set up. The prospector's camp, 600 yards down the corridor, had been a previous shot. The partial mark near our survey line had been a correction, and now it was ready. I shouted. I do not know exactly what I said, some combination of run and move and off the fall line, but the words I remember most clearly are the ones I screamed at the Caldwell brothers, who were 50 yards below me on the slope. Sideways. Get off the line. Go sideways. Fenn heard me. I saw him turn and look up at the ridge, and I saw his body go still for one beat. The way a man's body goes still when his mind is processing something it has no category for. Then he moved. He moved laterally across the slope, off the fall line, scrambling across the talus toward the rock wall at the eastern edge of the bench, which was outside the projected path. Thomas did not move sideways. Thomas ran down the fall line. I cannot tell you why. I can tell you that running downhill when something comes from above is a deeply instinctive response. The same response that saves you from a boulder or a rolling log, and that it is exactly the wrong response for a creature that uses the fall line as its attack vector. I can tell you that I saw him running down, and that I screamed again, and that either he did not hear me or he could not change course. I can tell you that I watched him run toward the camp, toward the mule bench below the camp, running as fast as a young man can run on loose talus, and that he was fast and that it was not enough. I ran laterally. I scrambled across the slope to my right, away from the fall line, across exposed rock and loose talus, not looking up, not looking down, covering ground as fast as I could move. I got perhaps 60 feet off the survey line before the sound changed. The grinding became a roar. Not the roar of a slide, not exactly, but a sound in that family, deep, enormous, and accompanied by a vibration so intense that it stopped being a vibration and became something closer to a physical blow, transmitted through the ground and up through my legs and into my chest cavity. I fell on the talus. I do not know if I fell from the force of the ground movement or from my own failure to keep my feet. I was on my hands and knees on the quartzite when the thing passed through the fall line. I heard it. I did not see it in those first seconds because my face was down and I was holding the rock. What I heard was beyond anything I can fit into existing categories of sound. The friction of it, that grinding exhalation of stone against stone, was the loudest thing I have ever experienced. Loud enough to be painful, loud enough to blank out coherent thought. Beneath that was an impact sound, periodic and massive, and I understood in some functional part of my mind that what I was hearing was the ridges on its underside contacting the rock face in sequence, like the teeth of a gear engaging, each contact point a hammer blow, the whole sequence running together into a continuous roar as the speed increased. It lasted perhaps 8 seconds from the moment I fell to the moment the main sound passed below me. 8 seconds from the ridge to the valley floor. Then there was a secondary sound, a crash of enormous weight reaching the talus break at the bottom of the slope and going into the valley, and then smaller sounds, rock fragments raining down, debris settling, and then silence. The same quality of silence I had heard at the prospector's camp. Complete. No birds, no wind, no voices. I stayed on the rock for some time. I do not know how long. My legs would not work correctly when I first tried to stand. Not from injury, but from some failure of the connection between my intention and my body's execution. I sat on the talus with my back against a rock, and I looked at where the camp had been. The bench was gone. The rock wall that had sheltered the uphill side of the camp was still there, but the bench itself, the flat 40-foot platform of ground on which we had been sleeping for 6 days, was scoured down to bare limestone. The rock surface in the path of the creature was polished in the way the prospector's camp had been polished. The parallel grooves ran through it at the same spacing I had seen before. The survey stakes were gone. The tent was gone. The instrument cases were gone. The supply cache, 6 weeks of survey records and seasonal equipment, gone. All of it swept into the fall line and carried to the valley floor. The mule bench below was also gone. All 4 animals, the panniers, the feed bags, everything, gone. I looked along the slope for Fen Caldwell. It took me about 3 minutes to locate him. He was approximately 40 feet from where I had ended up, pressed into a crack in the rock wall at the eastern edge of the bench, alive. He had blood on his face from a cut above his eyebrow, where a fragment of flying debris had caught him. He was looking at the scoured bench with an expression I am not going to try to describe in a formal proceeding, because it would not survive the translation. We did not speak for some time. Then Fen said, "Thomas." I said, "I know." That is the only direct exchange I will record from those minutes, because it is the only one that carried meaning. We looked for Thomas for 2 hours. We went down the slope as far as we could safely travel, and we searched the edge of the scoured path and the talus below, and we did not find him. We found the edge of the transit rod about 300 feet below the camp position, bent at a severe angle, the brass fittings stripped clean. I picked it up. I do not know entirely why. It was the only identifiable object we could find from the entire camp, and there was something in me that needed to take back some material evidence that this had happened, that there had been a camp here, that it was real. I carried it down the mountain. We did not find Thomas Caldwell that day, or the following day, or the 3rd day, when the party from Ouray came up in response to Fen's wire from the valley floor. The recovery team searched the valley below the scoured path and found debris scattered across the lower talus, fragments of equipment and canvas and supplies, the bent and broken remnants of the pack panniers, the bones of one of the mules with no tissue remaining, as if the material had been removed rather than decomposed. They did not find Thomas Caldwell. They did not find Clem Surtees. Wait, I have not told you about Surtees. I should have told you before now, and I apologize to the board for the disorder. I have been over this account many times in the past 6 weeks, and I cannot always find the right place for each part of it. Let me tell you about Surtees now, because the inquiry needs to understand what I saw before I ran. When I shouted and ran laterally across the slope, Surtees was approximately 40 yards from me on the survey line, uphill of my position. He had been recording elevations in the field book. When I shouted, he turned and looked at me, and then he looked up at the ridge, and then he looked at the transit on its tripod, and he took 3 steps toward the transit. He was going to secure the instrument. In the first seconds after understanding that something catastrophic was happening, Clem Surtees' instinct was to secure the survey equipment. It was the most perfectly characteristic thing he could possibly have done, and it put him directly in the fall line. And that is the last I saw of him. I did not go back to pull him away. I was already running. There was no time, or there may have been enough time, and I used it to run sideways instead of toward him, and I do not know with certainty which of those is true, and I will carry not knowing for the rest of whatever I have remaining. The transit was not in the scoured path when we searched afterward. It was not in the talus below. The recovery team did not find it. Neither was Surtees. Whatever the creature's passage collected, it did not scatter selectively. It took what was in its path, and it took it clean. I want to address one aspect of this event that the inquiry may find significant for future warnings. When I looked up at the ridgeline in those 4 seconds before the creature released, I had the clear impression that it was aware of my position. I cannot prove this. It may be the retrospective imposition of intent onto what was a mechanical event. But the head, which I had not clearly described because I was primarily registering the body and the tail, was oriented downslope, and within the general mass of its forward end, there were structures that my mind interpreted as sensory organs, positioned on what I understood to be the lower forward surface, the same surface that contacted the rock. They were not eyes in the conventional sense. I am not going to claim I saw eyes. I am saying that the forward portion of the animal was oriented toward the slope, and appeared to be taking information from it, and that for the 4 seconds during which I was looking up at it, and it was looking down at the slope, I had the distinct and durable impression that it was not simply an animal acting on instinct. It had spent a week above us. It had adjusted its position with precision across multiple days. Whatever its mechanism of perception, it had been using that mechanism deliberately. I told you at the beginning that I would tell you what I did, and that you could judge me for it afterward. I have told you. I told the men the danger was geological when I had reason to believe it was not. I kept the party on the mountain when Fen Caldwell asked to leave. I chose the mules and the survey cache and another hour of work over the lives of 2 men who trusted my judgment, and those 2 men did not come back from that mountain. I escaped by running sideways across the talus, while Clem Surtees went toward the transit, and Thomas Caldwell ran down the fall line. I did not stop either of them. I had 4 seconds and I used them to save myself. The bent transit rod is here on the table in front of this inquiry board. I submitted it as required when I filed this deposition. It is bent at approximately 40 degrees from its original axis, and the brass fittings have been removed from it as cleanly as if they had been machined off. The steel itself at the bend point has been compressed, not fractured, which means the force applied was both enormous and even, not a point impact but a distributed load, consistent with the passage of a very large object of uniform cross-section. I would ask the board to note the surface texture of the rod at the contact point. The scoring there is parallel, the same spacing as the marks in the limestone. That rod was in the path, and the same thing that made the grooves in the rock face made those marks on the steel. I am not asking the board to believe that what destroyed my survey party was a legendary creature. I am asking the board to look at the evidence and draw whatever conclusion the evidence supports. The rod is here. The groove measurements are in my field notes, which I am also submitting. The location of the prospector's camp, the dimensions of both scoured paths, the timing and duration of the vibrational events across 6 days, all of it is in those notes, written contemporaneously, before I had any reason to construct a narrative around it. I did not know what I was recording when I recorded it. I know now. I am telling you now. I said at the start that I have not slept more than 2 hours together since September 7th. That remains true as of the date of this deposition. I do not say that for sympathy. I say it because the inquiry asked for a complete account of my condition, and that is part of my condition. When I do sleep, the sound is there, the grinding, and then the silence after, which is worse. In the silence I hear Fen Caldwell saying Thomas's name, and I hear myself saying I know, and that is where I wake up. Fen Caldwell is alive. He is residing in Montrose with his mother's family. He declined to give a deposition to this inquiry, and I think the board should understand that as a man who asked to leave that mountain 3 days before the event and was overruled by his supervisor, he has said everything that needs to be said about this incident by his survival alone. His is not a failure of judgment. His judgment was correct on September 6th, and I disregarded it, and 2 men are dead. That is the accounting. That is the sum. I want to enter one additional item into the record before I finish. 3 days after Fen and I came down from the mountain and wired RA, before the recovery team went up, I went back to the valley floor below the slide path. Not up the mountain. I was not able to go up the mountain. But I went to the valley floor and I looked up at the ridge, and the creature was not on the cornice. The cornice was bare. The ridge was a ridge. The sky above it was blue. I stayed there for perhaps an hour. I have no good explanation for why. I was not searching for evidence. I was not looking for Thomas or Surtees. I think I wanted to see it again in some part of myself that had not yet fully incorporated what had happened, the part that was still arguing with the rest of me about what was real and what was possible. I looked at the ridge for an hour, and then I went back to town. I do not know where the creature is now. I do not know whether it is still on that ridge, or whether it moves between ranges as the seasons change. I do not know how many of the historical slide events in the San Juan High Country were what the timbermen said they were. I know what I saw on the morning of September 7th, 1908, and I know what it cost, and I know the difference between those two things. The survey was never completed. The mining authority has sent no additional parties to that corridor. I do not know whether that is because of this deposition, or because of the season closing, or because the authority has made a decision I have not been informed of. I would urge the board, in whatever capacity it has, to ensure that no survey crews, no prospecting parties, no construction teams are sent above 10,000 feet on that specific ridge system until there is a better understanding of what is up there and what it is capable of. The corridor can wait. It has no timber value, and its ore potential was, by my incomplete assessment, moderate at best. It is not worth a life. It proved not to be worth two. I have given this account in full and under oath. I have not embellished, and I have not omitted. The field notes are there, and the rod is there, and Fen Caldwell is in Montrose, and the board can confirm any element of this account that can be externally verified. There is one thing I would ask you to confirm that cannot be externally verified, but which I will state plainly for the record. Clem Surtees was a precise man, meticulous, patient, not given to error. He spent his adult life measuring the world and recording what he found with scrupulous accuracy. He went toward the transit because the transit was his responsibility, and he did not leave his responsibilities unmet. I could have pulled him away. I had time enough for that, and then perhaps not enough to save myself, and I made the choice I made, and it was the wrong choice, and no outcome of this inquiry will change that arithmetic. He trusted my leadership for 4 years. I spent those 4 years building a debt I can never pay, and on the morning of September 7th, 1908, I spent his life to cancel a part of my own fear, and I have been trying to account for that every morning since. The board may determine this matter as it sees fit. I have nothing further to add. The transit rod is submitted as evidence. The field notes are submitted as evidence. I would ask that both be retained by the board and not returned to me. I do not need them back. I know what happened. Aldrich Pressler, licensed surveyor, State of Colorado. Deposition given October 21st, 1908, before the Ouray County Mining Authority Inquiry Board. Transcribed by the board secretary and signed in the presence of witnesses.